One of the important parts of a domain controller or a forest is trust. In other words, when you have large domains, you don't have just a single domain controller, you'll have many domain controllers. And there has to be this concept of when accessing resources through one domain controller, when it has to coordinate with other domains and forests and other and other trees and things like that, that there's some way for that trust to traverse through these different nodes. So trust is kind of an important concept with Active Directory. So the relationship defines whether and how security principals from one domain can access network resources in another domain. They can be established automatically between all of the domains within a forest, but you can also have trust that exists between different forests, so they can access domains without having to log on more than once. In other words, going back to that example of merging companies, once you log into one forest, you don't want to have to log in again to a different forest to access resources if you're really part of the same overarching organization. So a user account would only need to exist in one of those domains, but they'd be able to access resources on both of those forests. There are two different types of trust. You have one-way trust and two-way trust. So a one-way trust is when we have a trust that exists between one principal and another, but not the other way around. So domain A trusts B, but B does not trust A. What's more common is a two-way trust, where users from both domains, once they trust each other, the trust is two directions. So if I trust someone else, then they implicitly also trust me. So that would be a two-way trust. An automatic trust is configured between domains in a forest. They're always two-way trusts. So any domains within the same forest will automatically have a two-way trust. And then, so you can have both one-way and two-way trusts that can be transitive or non-transitive. So let me talk about a transitive trust first. So a transitive trust is when A trusts B, B trusts C, therefore A trusts C. In other words, if I'm looking to buy a new car, and I have a friend that trusts a certain dealership, and I say, hey, what's a good dealership for me to buy a car? And I trust my friend. If they tell me they trust a certain dealership, I'm going to trust that dealership because my friend trusts them also. Although in reality, it seems like we can't really trust any car dealers. But that's the basic idea behind a transitive trust. It's where the trust flows through these relationships. So an automatic trust relationship is created between domains in a forest which are transitive to a trust. In other words, anytime you have a forest of domains, all of those domains trust one another through this transitive trust. In other words, they all trust each other because they all have something in common. So they follow the domain parent-child relationship in the tree. So another example is a shortcut trust, which is a non-transitive trust relationship. So a shortcut trust is where you configure a trust manually between domains in the same forest, which bypasses the normal referral process. They are transitive and can be configured as one-way or two-way trusts, and they can be configured when user accounts often need to access resources in domains several referrals away. In other words, if they're trying to access resources that are through many different levels of that tree structure, it may make sense to use a shortcut trust to do that. If access to a different forest is needed, use a forest trust to an external trust. So a forest trust provides a one-way or two-way trust between different forests. So this can be created between the forest root domains of an Active Directory forest running Windows Server 2003 or later. It is a transitive trust, so all domains in one forest can trust all the domains in a different forest. The trust isn't transitive from one forest to another. You can also do external trusts and realm trusts. So an external trust is a one-way or a two-way non-transitive trust between two domains that aren't in the same forest, and is generally used to create a trust between two domains in different forests, or to create a trust with a Windows 2000 or NT domain, which doesn't support this natively. So again, you can create that trust manually for an older domain prior to Windows 2003. In other words, if you have a Windows 2000 or an NT domain that you want to set up a trust relationship, you can create that relationship as an external trust, even though it's inside the same organization or between different forests. A realm trust is used to integrate users of other operating systems. So if it's outside the Windows ecosystem, then you'll use a realm trust to do that. So to configure a Active Directory trusts, you have to have DNS configured. So that all of the FQDNs and all of the participating domains can be resolved. In other words, everyone in this ecosystem must be able to resolve the FQDNs across the entire enterprise in order for a trust to work, because they have to be able to reference one another. So before creating the trust, you can make sure that you can resolve all of the FQDNs of the domain by using the NSLOOKUP tool in Windows, which is just the command line in Windows. So that's what the dialog looks like when you're setting up trust in Active Directory. And then configuring forest trust. So configuring a forest trust is similar to creating a shortcut trust. The main consideration is making sure that DNS is configured correctly in both the forest and root domains. And three most common ways are conditional forwarders, stub zones, and secondary zones. You can also configure a DNS server to act as the root server for the DNS namespaces of both forests. All right, so an external trust is created between two domains in different forests, or between domains in a Windows Server 2003-2008 forest and a 2000, as I've discussed earlier. An external trust is not transitive and is nearly identical to creating a forest trust, so it's really not all that different from a forest trust. When creating a realm trust, main consideration should be whether or not it should be transitive. So as far as trust properties, in the General tab, there are some settings, as you can see here. I'm not going to read all these to you, but in the textbook, they also show you how to configure these trust properties. And this is what the dialog boxes look like that you'll find in both the textbook and when you complete the lab. So we haven't talked about SIDs yet, but basically a SID is sort of a unique identifier for any principal or anything. Well, a principal being a user or a group or an OU. So these principals are basically assigned to SID. So here's the problem: is that these SIDs are generally assigned by the by an FSMO. So there's an FSMO role that does this. That basically assigns these SIDs to objects. So the problem is, if I'm in one forest and I have this transitive trust to someone in a different forest, then I might be a member of a group that has a certain SID in my forest, but that SID might belong to a different group in the other forest. So there could be some confusion there. And SID filtering, basically what this does is it allows you to block SIDs that were generated in a different domain. So it prevents the SIDs from a different domain being applied to a domain through a transitive trust relationship. This is generally enabled by default if you are for external trusts and for forest trusts, because there is no single authority for those SIDs outside of a forest or outside of, for an external trust. So you don't want these rogue SIDs being passed in. So an attacker theoretically could build a domain and construct it such that they know that the SID for some object that has access to something within the other domain has a certain value. Maybe they could construct their own set of SIDs to have an identical value, and then have that pass through that trust relationship and be able to access resources they're not supposed to. So by default, this is enabled when you have a trust relationship that might be able to take advantage of that flaw. But you can also disable or enable this manually as well. So it's important to understand what that is when you're setting up trust relationships. So that's the basics on trust. We're going to talk about Active Directory trust and certificates later on. So we're going to talk about certificate services in another unit, which is an important part of understanding how trust works. But in the next slide deck, I'm going to talk about upgrading domains in forests with Windows 2012.